So I would like to welcome you all to the fourth seminar of Creatures. As you know, Creatures is a Horizon 2020 project that is bringing together diverse creative practices with the idea of looking at how they can contribute to socio-ecological transformation. So in this process, the notion of transformation is obviously key at understanding like how to define it and how to assess and evaluate it, which is why we have invited Giuseppe to join us today for this seminar. Since he has done so much work and especially coming from a very different direction to the notion of transformation than many of us within Creatures. Giuseppe is an associate professor of social change for sustainability at the University of Utrecht, and he will be presenting some of the work that he has done on kind of like tracing the theoretical roots on the notion of transformation for sustainability. Our very own Creature, Anne Light, who is a professor of design and creative technology, and also like very invested in her work in understanding the idea of transformation from the creative practices perspective, will respond to his presentation and will moderate the discussion afterwards. So I would like to welcome them both and also all of you, and I hope you will enjoy the session. So with that, just Giuseppe, I think I'll pass the word to you.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me just put the slides on. Okay, so well, thanks a lot for the invitation and for organizing this. Yeah, it's great. I don't.
If you want to join.
Okay, I hear some voice in the background. Yeah, I don't interact very often with researchers and practitioners in the creative sectors. You will see from my slide, I'm not a very skilled person on that side, but I really look forward to the interaction and to the conversation. So I will definitely leave time for that. So I've been asked to talk about this paper of mine, which came out in 2015, and I will do so for most of the talk. Towards the end, I will also talk about ongoing work that I'm doing on transformation to sustainability, which connects to some, I think, research directions which are sort of exist in the field. And therefore, I've listed here a few of the more recent publications, which I will refer to, and the slides will be available. So yeah, you can get access to those later. Okay, I'll start with a bit of background. Around the year 2010 or so, various publications came out that used the word transformation to sustainability. They were of course, in an interdisciplinary field covering global environmental change, resilience, sustainability studies. And broadly speaking, all these works were referring to some sort of fundamental major change as opposed to minor incremental marginal change. And of course, these qualifiers per se might mean very different things, but there was this idea of really fundamental change that was needed to achieve sustainability. And what was interesting was that this emphasis on transformation reflected also a move or a foregrounding of the social sciences and humanities in the field of global environmental change research, which was taking place, yeah, with, for example, the foundational publications of Karen O'Brien on transformation, the position of the International Social Science Council, among other sort of publications and debates that were started at the time. And really, this signaled a new role for the social sciences and humanities. The idea was that, yes, we need to know about the Earth system, right? climate systems, soils, and so on. That's, of course, we need to know about that to move towards sustainability. But where we really need more knowledge and probably different ways of doing research is on the social science and humanities. Yeah? We need to know more and better about human actors, and we need different forms of engagement with them. My research since earlier had focused on questions of change towards sustainability. So I really delved avidly and hopefully in this literature. So the emphasis on the societal rather than, for example, the technical change, the foregrounding of the social dynamics, and the ambition to understand and promote change at this deep level were really particularly appealing to me. And then when I started reading the literature, I realized that researchers was using this term, transformation, but really they meant things that to me looked very different. So I pasted here a couple of definitions, or two quotes from two different publications. And I highlighted here some keywords. And I think it's pretty clear that we're talking here different things. I mean, there might be, yes, transformation to sustainability, but what qualifies change as transformation, according to these different researchers, are really different things. And what was surprising to me is that in reading other literature on transformation, often different definitions of transformation would be referred to, they were clumped together. There seemed to be no awareness of these distinctions, and some other researchers were talking about transformation as one thing, right? And so this was a bit disturbing. And of course, we know that also from other debates, like the debate on sustainable agriculture, which is one of the thematic area I'm involved in, that there are advantages and disadvantages of having very rigorous and very sort of clear definitions of concepts. So loose definitions or allow for dialogue across disciplines, across fields, across interest groups, but they're also more vulnerable to co-optation. On the other hand, a more analytic, more rigorous definition, perhaps more narrow, might inform analysis better, but of course, it also puts some more rigid border around the concept. So the question remained, what is this transformation that everybody's talking about, and is it a useful concept? So I decided to engage in this literature review with the aim of mapping, really, this field to make sense of it. I didn't aim to develop a new theory of transformation. I didn't aim to support or defend one particular notion or theory of transformation. It's really, the aim was really more to provide a critical perspective on this field as it was emerging, and the implications that this diversity of concept might have. So you see here some of the questions that guided the review. What was the concept that were emerging? Are they different, similar, in what way? Are they different concepts associated with different research approaches? And what does it all mean essentially for those who are interested in understanding and promoting transformative processes? So I scanned the literature. You find the detail on like search strings, etc. in the paper. So I would skip this part, which is, I think, not the most interesting one, but essentially 138 journal articles were the ones that I really read, and after some process of filtering. And then what I was interested was really the key source, the key definition, the foundational works from which these 138 papers had based their understanding of transformation. And I didn't predefine sort of the number of those key concepts and sources. I was open to find out what came out from the literature review, but the idea was that probably, that hypothesis, there would be a limited number of concepts that would recur in the literature. And then for the analysis of these concepts, so to compare them and see whether, to what extent they were similar or different, I turned to the sociology of social change. I conceive transformation as a process of change. So it seemed almost a natural sort of field to borrow some meta categories. Yeah, so a framework, some meta categories that could help me compare essentially different notions of transformation. So I use these 4 dimensions: the system model, form and temporal range, state of causality, and social consciousness and outcome. You see some descriptors there, but the point was to, for example, to see, okay, does the concept of a notion of transformation imply that transformation takes place in the long term, right, as a condition for change to be considered transformational? Or does is change transformational only when it reaches a particular outcome, right? For example, increased social equality or increased resilience. Or is there an implication that transformational change is inherently deliberate or emergent, right? So these were the type of questions that a framework like this would help me ask to interrogate these different definitions of transformation. Okay, I'll move to the findings. At the first sort of the most rough level, I could identify that approximately half of the papers that I had didn't really define transformation. So they used the term, but it was used in a very loose, in a very vague, if you want, way. Often used as a metaphor, right? But there's no clear sort of analytical sort of definition. Of the other papers, the other half that did define transformation, I could then trace back, okay, the sort of the key definitions or the sources where they were basing their definition. And I identified 8 such notions of transformation to sustainability, and you can see them here. So this, you see skill, graphical skills I have here, very poor, but the idea is very rudimentarily to show some sort of the proximity, the conceptual proximity of different notions of transformation and their overlaps as I observe them in the literature. So some papers, for example, using defining transformation on a sort of a mix of regime shift and societal transition. I really don't have the time to define and describe all of these different definitions. You find them in the paper, and I will talk about them. I also assume that to this audience, most, if not all, of these notions are familiar, are known. So what I would like to highlight, more than sort of the definitions, and there's 8 definitions, is the intellectual roots of these notions of transformation to sustainability. And we can see that there are some quite distinct traditions, intellectual traditions that to which these notions refer. So, the Pelling's definition, which I also pasted, or part of it I pasted in a previous slide, refers to the human security. It comes from the work on human security, vulnerability, adaptation to climate change, etc. It's quite a distinct type of scholarship than the social metabolism scholarship that looks at very long-term transitions, right? From pre-agrarian societies to agrarian societies, industrial, etc. Right? So really long phases in civilization, and so on. Right? So there's a resilience background, transition theory, and social practice, and then there were some notions of transformation which were somehow I couldn't really fit into a particular tradition because they were more interdisciplinary. They would build on different different traditions. Coming to the comparison, okay, so far it's been more like, in a sense, the big picture, the description, but then, okay, there are these 8 definitions, the 8 concepts, but do they really differ? To what extent, in which way, and what does it mean? So for the comparison, I turn to that framework. And the first 2 dimensions, system models and form and temporal range. So yeah, the definition of the system and sort of assumptions about the temporal development of transformation. For these 2 dimensions, there weren't that many differences, really. Of course, if you look at the system model, yes, some notions of transformation refer to socio-ecological systems, other to socio-technical systems. For other, the system is defined by practices, social practices, or bundles of practices. Different notions might emphasize, the civilization or lower levels of analysis. But the really strong common denominator is the understanding of systems as complex systems and the understanding of transformation as a change of the system rather than within the system, okay? So there's this common sort of, understanding of complexity as being a defining element of whichever sort of system we're talking about. And also for the form and temporal range, there's common ideas that we find in different understandings of transformation. So the fact that transformation is a non-linear, non-teleological process, it's historical. So except for one definition on transformation adaptation, all the definitions assume that transformation cannot be undone. It's not something you can do and then undo because it's an historical process and you might try to revert it, but you don't go to an early stage, you go back to an early stage, right? So there's this, the ruptures and so on. This is, of course, consistent with an understanding of system as complex systems. There are some differences. I already mentioned earlier, the social metabolism looks at very sort of long-term shifts in civilization, like the rise of agrarian societies. Other, like sustainability transition, socio-technical transition scholarship looks at a few decades, 50 years, around 50 years, for example, as this time span of a transition. But even there, the short versus long-term distinction is often blurred because conceptualizing system as complex system, there's always this possibility of tipping points, that where change that might seem to happen in the long term actually precipitates, in a much shorter time frame. The most interesting differences where I could observe them in relation to the other 2 dimensions. So the whether there's any social consciousness, what is the seat of causality, the agency behind transformation, and then the outcome. And here, so there's a general understanding that yes, transformation can occur due to endogenous or exogenous causes, but there's a clear distinction between those definitions that stress deliberate, transformation as a deliberate process, or as an emergent process where there's no human actor that really has control over it, right? Okay, it's an emergent property of the system. And there's a certain intersection and overlap with notions of transformation as anticipatory, for example, versus reactive. It happens before a crisis or as a reaction to a crisis, or forced by, for example, a crisis, or active in terms of a deliberate choice of human actors, human agents that decide to change fundamentally in some sort of desired direction. And the outcome is also an area or a dimension in which I observe differences. Does a sustainable outcome define transformation? Well, according to some definition, yes. Yeah. Change is not transformational if we don't observe a particular outcome. For others, it's more open. Yeah, the definition of transformation is not determined by a particular outcome. So in some more prescriptive definition, for example, we would like to see empowerment, yeah, more empowered communities, or communities that are more capable to adapt to climate change. And these would be sort of an intrinsic element of transformational change. And bringing these two things together, these two dimensions together, I then try to think, okay, do they map? Is there a match between sort of the prescriptive, descriptive, if you want, axis, and the emergent or deliberate understanding of transformation, yeah, the other axis? And indeed, this is, again, qualitative. There's no particular empirical basis here, other than really thinking about these elements, yeah, this dimension, how different definitions seem to position themselves with respect to these analytical dimensions. And what I think we can see in this diversity, yeah, the diverse set of definitions of transformation, is that they span across sort of a continuum, if you want, where on the one end we have more analytic or descriptive type of definition, so where change is emergent and it's descriptive, yeah, and the other end we have sort of more prescriptive definitions where there's an assumption that transformation, yes, it's deliberate, it can be, you know, pursued deliberately by human agents. And I think that this distinction also matches a different in terms of research approaches. So on the one hand, we have the solution-oriented research, where essentially the aim is to bring about change, right? Transformational change. And on the other hand, we have more analytic descriptive research, where the aim is more to understand change and how it happens and why. And this distinction between analytic, descriptive, and solution-oriented research is quite sort of common and established in sustainability science. And I think we see it also on transformation or research on transformation. So what are some of the implications of this review, or, you know, some reflections? So I think there is this distinction between analytical descriptive notions of transformation and solution-oriented. And they tend to use also the term transformation perhaps in different terms, more as a substantial concept with more rigorous, and more as a metaphor, yeah, for the solution-oriented approaches. In the paper, I do defend the need to define transformation to avoid the risk of co-option. And again, for me, a parallel is that of the notion of sustainable agriculture, which has been co-opted quite clearly and essentially doesn't mean anything anymore, yeah, the term sustainable agriculture. And I wouldn't want transformation to end up like that. Thinking about the distinction, yeah, this distinction here between these two methodological approaches, one reflection that I put in the paper was about so the implications of funding for funding agencies. So with research moving towards more solution-oriented approaches, yeah, funding agencies wanting to see impact, yeah, in society. So not being happy anymore with fundamental research, but wanting to see some sort of impact in real life. The open question for me is whether perhaps you know, certain types of definitions of, or sorry, certain methodological approaches would be preferred, and those who are more participatory, more solution-oriented, etc. But then whether that would also imply that certain definitions of transformation would be essentially implicitly excluded from funding. And what would that mean? Are we missing anything? You know, if certain type of research or certain type of sort of understandings of transformation don't find essentially funding and are not tested and not in the field and might not yield any insight on transformation. And then the fourth point was about conceptual spaces. So the idea that these transformation concepts are different lenses essentially to look at this phenomenon from different perspectives. And I thought it's quite fruitful. It can be quite fruitful to look at the possibility of to integrate different theories or look at where these theories might meet, because all of them have their own limitations, yeah, their own gaps. So is there any possibility to complement theories in ways that can be fruitful for understanding or promoting transformation? So this was essentially the paper. I'll very briefly talk about some of the directions of research on transformation that I'm working on at the moment, which link, as you will see, to some of these implications. So research, of course, there's been a lot of research on transformation to sustainability since 2015 in many different directions. Some scholars have proposed new frameworks. Others have worked on the definition of transformation and how it differs from transitions or other similar concepts. Other scholars have worked on the translation of more abstract work, yeah, theorizations of transformation into practice, like, for example, development practice or environmental policy. Yeah? And others have worked on specific issues, yeah, of transformation to sustainability, like politics and governance, yeah, and many others. 4 dimensions that I've engaged, or directions that I've engaged with are these ones, and I'll tell something very briefly about each of them. So the first one is the connection between transformation and capitalism. And if we look back at the history, so where I started actually this talk, research on transformation really came in the global environmental change sort of community. This research emerged as a reaction to this emphasis on Earth system, yeah, the environmental sciences, and the recognition that human dimensions of environmental change were, of course, key and central. So that was a big change, yeah, in thinking about transformation and introducing transformation to the field. I think that further change that we are seeing is from sustainability transformation to transformation of and beyond capitalism. So more and more sort of researchers in broad field of transformation, sustainability transition, transformation research, realize that to address the root causes of environmental change, we need to address sort of the central drivers, yeah, of environmental change. So the idea that if societies that pursue endless expansion, which is a central tenet of capitalism, head to those scenarios that are very scary, right, in terms of global warming, and not to mention all the impacts on biodiversity loss, plastic pollution, etc. So various scholars have questioned, yeah, the possibility of meeting global sustainability targets without challenging and transforming capital institutions and their cultural, social, and political architecture. And here there's just a couple of quotes just to illustrate that. And yet, many of the most formalized transition or transformation theories and frameworks think about transformation within capitalism, yeah, and reproduce some taken for granted understandings of the economy, for example. So for me, the intersection of global environmental change, capitalism, and sustainability transformation sort of thinking and research is really key, and it's really stimulating for me. So one of the questions is, how do we make sense of envision and practice post-capitalist transformation, yeah, to really address the deep drivers of environmental change. And in part, to answer that question, I turn also to ongoing transformation that happen from the grassroots. And of course, grassroots initiatives, grassroots movements are studied by different communities. For example, Seeds of Good Anthropocenes, grassroots innovation movement in the sustainability transition communities. I tend to focus on the type of grassroots initiatives that show or involve some post-capitalist practices. In doing this, I integrate different strands of literature, from autonomous geography, the diverse economies, the Gibbs and Graham type of work, and the more conventional, if you want, grassroots or community-led scholarship on grassroots or community-led initiatives or innovations. And I think this scholarship helps us sort of understand if and to what extent these type of initiatives help us move from some of those central tenets of the economic and socio-economic model that we live in to something something different that we might call post-capitalist. Third line is the idea of transformation and disarticulation, or if you want, disruption. A lot of the transformation and also the transition research has essentially an innovation bias. Innovation is more palatable, it motivates, it attracts funding. We want to think about transformation as creating something new. And that's really, it's more exciting than thinking of, okay, transformation is about leaving behind something that is unsustainable. And yet, I think, and I'm not the only one, because there's a growing sort of field of studies around destabilization, phase out, exnovation, and there are also, again, many different terms used to point to the idea that actually there's something that we need to get rid of in order to move towards sustainability. And this getting rid is not a consequence of innovation, but it actually might be a precondition to that. A lot of that research is about technologies, but how do we think about this destabilization, this decline of not only of a single technology, if you want, or consumption practice, but of the model, the cultural model, the social practices more broadly, And so here, really, I sort of the hypothesis I work on with my team is that transformation doesn't come by addition, or not only by adding new values, practices, innovations, etc., but it comes also by subtracting, decolonizing the imaginary, decolonizing the politics, disrupting, or creating autonomous spaces that exit, in a sense, from the mainstream system. So the idea that these grassroots innovations or grassroots spaces don't necessarily need to compete and outcompete the established system, but actually want to make space to break out of that system. And that might be a generation of transformative change. And I'll finish with the last point, which connects to the previous ones, of course, and also to the 2015 paper. So to think about this destabilization, this disruption, the work we're doing in the ongoing Unmaking project with my team is really to try to work with different theories and explore the possibilities to integrate, complement different theories. You see them there. I won't talk about them in detail, but theories that really all point to this idea that we need to subtract, to destabilize, to disrupt as a condition for transformative change. And we apply them, of course, to initiatives that involve post-capitalist practices. And some of these theories really have never been mobilized before to study transformation to sustainability, and they've never been integrated. So there's a challenge there, but I think it's a stimulating one. And I will finish here. Thank you very much again for the invitation, and I look forward to the conversation now. So I'll stop sharing. Okay, here we are. Okay.
Shall I shall I thank, or Christina thanking, how should we do this? But thank you. Yes.
Thanks a lot.
So I found that so exciting in the context of what we're talking about, and also the future of the world. So thank you very much for that really good tour, both of where you were and what attracted us to that paper, which we see as something that we're engaging with quite regularly, I think, in how we think about our practices and what we mean by transformative. But also that view forwards about where you're traveling to. And it feels very aligned with the way that Creatures is formulated, and the kinds of partner ethics and actions that we're working with. I wanted to perhaps situate Creatures in your framework, the one you demonstrated. That I appreciate that it's qualitative, but it was quite interesting to see how we might map onto it and perhaps open some discussions in that context. But I also just want to put in as a footnote, when I was first aware of your Unmaking project, that we have also got the practitioners who've got an Unmaking studio here, who are both design theorists and unmakers. So I'm hoping that we might be able to also invite, obviously that's one of the reasons I was excited to see Christina and also. So I'm sure you know their work, but I would like to make sure that that is a bit of a dialogue at some point too, because it kind of talks about how the theory can be enacted, which is very much what we're trying to do. But I think just to introduce what Creatures sees its ambitions in transformative terms as, and of course this is just my perspective, and for anyone who doesn't know me, I run Lara and Kat and I look after the observatory part of Creatures, which is where we try and formulate some standards of research, observation, and so on, and also kind of throw out theory occasionally, or have meetings about what we think we're learning, in the context that everybody is very much embedded in making these intellectual concepts, shall we say, that we're very much trying to do this as a big collaboration with a big team, many of whom are here today. But that gives me, as perhaps the person who stuck my oar in and said we needed to look at what the arts and creative practice is doing, to say that we're very interested in cultural transformation. And in that, I don't just mean the change of institutions that hold culture for us, but very much in the way that we come at things, the way I think that you articulated. How is it that we make our world? What kind of ontological transformations might we be needing so that we can think differently and we can move into post-capitalist societies and worlds and speak different languages about this? And I think this even gets to the point, as we've been discussing, where evaluation may belong to a world that we're actually leaving. So we're not even sure how we can articulate some of our goals now, because the kind of change that we're making may be so profound that we don't recognize our own ambitions, that we're actually creating a subversion that produces something that doesn't recognize its antecedents in the same way. And I think smart practices are already very engaged in that, but one challenge is how you reconcile what you do in the moment with that bigger vision of how things might be different. So I think that kind of transformation underpins our understanding of how one might move to a changed world and living differently on the planet and with other creatures. And in that sense, it's quite interesting to try and pin us down as being either descriptive or solution focused. I think we are solution focused, but perhaps in quite a bizarre way, in that we're trying to stimulate emergence. So I'm not sure where that puts us. Maybe it puts us in a place, because we're very aware that we're doing it in the context of other transformations which are descriptive and which run through our work, and the way that we're never going to be the voice of transformation. And so I think we probably occupy something that's kind of a bit more top left than most of the things on your diagram. But then I think, as you say, it's a bit of an artifact. You've just created something, as we all do, to see what happens. So maybe that's not terribly meaningful. We're definitely not a metaphor for transformation. Our goal is really to work out what happens. And that, of course, is a huge question and not one we're necessarily going to be able to answer, but I think it's still worth the asking. It's like, what happens when you go into that situation and something transforms? What are the stages of it, if that's meaningful? What is the non-linearity of it? So it's been so exciting to hear you spell out the kind of shape of something that we can respond to. And in doing that, I think we're really looking at something that combines maybe process philosophy with kind of impact studies, with cultural practice, with what we understand creative practice to be when we look more broadly and include repair and some of the unmaking practices that you listed. I would say that a community garden sits alongside everything else we're doing. And you've seen a really interesting seaweed shape that lives in Alto. So perhaps I'm going to stop there because that's me having talked for nearly 5 minutes perhaps, and we want to make sure that everyone else gets a word in. But just wanted to see whether we could learn in the moment and help situate ourselves. So thank you so much. Now, I do want to hear from lots of people. I'm really delighted to see that there are nearly 40 of us here. So I'm on gallery view. I'm going to lose the chat unless you think that's going to be the best way to communicate with me, because there are just so many of you. But if you could raise a hand, I think I can just see everybody, which is great. And then you can raise your, oh, there we go. Can I pass straight to you then, please?
Thank you, Anne, and thank you for this great creature seminar, Giuseppe, for your presentation. So I'm a professor of sustainable design in Aalto, not part of Creatures Project, but I'm a sustainability scientist and a design researcher. So I had my feet in both grounds for quite a long time. I have maybe 2 questions. One is about the typology the framework that you use to do your analysis was very helpful and interesting. And your findings in the light of that framework are very interesting, but I didn't see any reference to the politics of the discourses that you have analyzed, and the framework did not really allow you to do that. So some reflections on that would be really interesting, particularly because you're interested in transformations to post-capitalist futures. So that's one. And the second one is, as a sustainable scientist / design researcher, what I have been observing in the past years that there has finally been engagement with design, and admittedly creative practices are broader than design, but that happens very, very instrumentally and not intellectually. Design is seen as an instrumental tool that can be in the service of sustainability science, solution-oriented, approaches. And we're missing that kind of intellectual engagement, and I'm very sad about that. So your reflections on how can a better kind of equal collaboration can be established so that we can actually, cross-fertilize both areas, both discourses a little bit more effectively. So 2 very different questions, but thank you.
Yeah, thanks. I answered them straight away, right? Or
please do.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. The question on the politics. So clearly, the dimensions in the framework are very abstract, right? We're talking really of meta categories, but they are not. So what they helped me to do was to ask questions about these definitions or these concepts of transformation, and I think there are 2 dimensions where the politics would come out, if there is one, if it's an element of these definitions. And one is on the social consciousness, or more the agency, right? Whether there's agency in transformation and the outcome. I think the reason why it doesn't come out a lot in the paper is that very few of those definitions actually have politics as a central element, or at least at the time. Now I think some developments in for example, in sustainability transition research has foregrounded the politics and power dynamics much more. But at the time, if you think of the resilience notions, social metabolism, social practice, these are all intellectual route where power and politics are not the central element. But in the notion of that is rooted in human security, then you do have, you know, a particular outcome, normative outcome as being, yeah, being sort of defining transformation, and the agency, yeah, the deliberate role of agents to pursue a certain desirable transformation. So for me, it was a matter of comparing different definitions, yeah, or concepts of transformation and see. And I think where there is these elements of politics, they would come out in these dimensions. But I think the problem is that most of those definitions didn't really talk much about the politics and power. The other question is tough. It's tougher than the first one. I don't know, honestly, I think I would have to I don't know, to think more about that. I mean, there's a lot that goes on, that there's a lot of, you know, for example, designers, but also, you know, architects and planners, and a lot of stuff goes on in our systems, social systems, and it has also often long-lasting impacts on you know, the social dynamics, environmental impacts of our way of living, etc. I don't have a clear answer, but I think I can definitely see how the, you know, there is a need for bringing in. So on the one hand, you could say, okay, for people like me to understand more of that instrumental logics that drive, you know, how different actors, you know, design objects, plan cities, and so on. And on the other hand, to bring in more of this debate into practice. And I know of some examples that try to do this, but how this can be done, not by experiments here and there, but in a more structured way, honestly, I don't have a solution there. But I definitely see the need, and I agree with that need.
If I can also add to that, and I think it is one of those things we're not going to solve today, but there is also the distinction between design theory, which is, you know, a research area where we're actually trying to understand transformation ourselves, and design practice, where perhaps it may be a less critical activity, or it, you know, it needs to, we have our own schisms. And I think it's really interesting how all these different disciplines need to speak to each other when we're talking about something as profound as this kind of change that we need to be making. Where else do I see a hand? Was that a used hand? Go for it. I think, oh, no. Okay, Lara, please. I can see that, yeah.
Hi, Giuseppe. Thanks for a really fantastic presentation. I loved the paper, and I really was very inspired by where you're sort of taking the Unmaking project. And I think on creatures, when we're looking at creative practice, so that's kind of a really big umbrella cross section between, you know, commercial design and really kind of art that considers itself, you know, deeply in kind of artistic communities in the artistic realm. And we're trying to say, okay, well, what might this spectrum of practices do, even though they're kind of enmeshed in these different regimes? And I was really interested that in your diagram, you're including some projects like the grassroots innovation, like Repair Cafe, that's kind of building this alternative infrastructure where the kind of market is failing. There's this kind of social infrastructure that's post-capitalist. But I noticed that you were also thinking about things that happen at the level of the imagination. And I was thinking about some of our art practices within creatures that are really, they're not about kind of creating alternative infrastructures, but they're about creating different kinds of experiences for people. So the practice is not kind of something tangible in the world that kind of is supposed to solve a problem, but something that's actually, I think, really interesting in kind of shifting people's imaginations or creating a different space, and in a way sort of also sometimes refusing to go into that instrumental space. And kind of, I think one of the things that we're trying to do in Creatures is sort of understand that spectrum of practices from the imagination, kind of concrete kind of alternatives. And I wondered kind of how you were thinking about those things that are taking place at the level of the imagination in your work.
Yeah, no, it's a very good point. So in one of those recent papers about the unmaking, of imaginaries, what I try to do, one of the things I try to do there is actually to link these levels somehow, because there's perhaps some of those attempts to change the imaginary at a purely symbolic level, but then I see a lot of those practices which are perhaps more instrumental in a sense, but they also work, perhaps it's not their main goal, right? But they also change ways of thinking, ways of relating to each other, relating, human and human non-human relations, and so on. And we see this, that my project and my sort of thematic area is more about agriculture and agri-food initiatives. So that's where I can see it more, but I know the literature about other areas as well. And I think you can see this as a pattern, right? It's not only about, repairing that appliances that doesn't work anymore, but there's something more coming in terms of, again, relating to each other, cooperation, sharing knowledge, vision. And why are you doing that? Why are you doing that? And why are you not buying a new whatever oven or whatever, right? So I try to think of these levels as mutually reinforcing, if you want, or how you can see different things, and these different levels in life around us, in the different initiatives. At the same time, you can think, okay, the symbolic, but then the symbolic at some point will inform action, right? If it stays at the symbolic level, well, fine in a sense, but at some point it will have an influence on decisions, on what we do or how we do things. And I think that's also, again, it's a connection between them. And there might be specific project initiatives that are focused on one level, but I think, to me, it's difficult to disentangle them. And I tend to understand these different, the more symbolic, the more material, and so on, as connected.
Thanks, that's really interesting to keep thinking about.
Yes, absolutely. So where are we going next? The one question that I had from the paper, but I feel that you may have superseded that now, is you talk about the dangers of solution-focused transformation, actually closing down the kind of space of what transformation might be. I wondered how you felt that has changed perhaps in the last 5 years since you, or maybe it's more than that, since you wrote the paper, whether there's become a more open and interdisciplinary welcome, shall we say?
Yeah, I think actually the paper had a very long review process. So it is before 2015, indeed, that paper was written. But anyway, I think, boundaries have blurred. That they are porous, and I think I do still see, I think, and the risk of that solution-oriented research to be, yeah, a bit too narrow. And I see the risk of labeling anything as transformation. So one big change that has been, or not necessarily a change, but something that, a conviction that I've been become very strong for me, is that I now refer to transformation only in the terms of essentially transforming beyond capitalism, transformation or beyond capitalism. But then you see the transformation also used, the term used, you know, when there's a new, I don't know, management system in place for managing a forest, right? Or water course, or you see essentially the use of the term applied to all these different, yeah, more, if you want, more narrow spheres. And of course, in a sense, yes, nobody forbids to use the term transformation, right? You can still use it, but it's I think for me, when I think about transformation, for me it has that meaning that I spoke about, and in that sense, yeah, I don't know if this answers, but this has been for me at least the change, or something that has been very sharp. You know, it's become very sharp for me as a distinction.
I think that's really useful, and we've been struggling with something that was smaller than system change in what we were trying to do, but we were looking for a common denominator between being able to respect individual practices and ambitions, and you know, so that, and when I say individual, I don't mean personal necessarily, but one of our project partners, say, might be a very large group of people, and they've negotiated some kind of mission, and yet it is entirely different from somebody else's mission. And yet, again, the bigger goal is to move us into what I think you're calling post-capitalism. And yet, of course, that is also very broad and unknowable. So I think for me, and I realize we need to wrap up in a moment, for me, there's something very exciting about the idea of transforming, because it suggests a world we cannot know. And we therefore have to do a lot of work to scaffold or trust or something for those kinds of movement. And I suspect that's why we ended up with the term in our project, because of its radical openness in a way. Yeah. But also that is its limitation in some ways too. So perhaps a final reflection, and then perhaps we need to wrap up.
Okay. So I want to.
No, please answer. Sorry, I didn't mean mine.
Just a comment. Just a comment, because so, which in a sense it's a clarification, but it's also the way I think about this scaling, you know, the system change, but then how to scale it down to something that is more concrete, right? That you can deal with. So I think of capitalism as a configuration, yeah, of different institutions, practices, and then the alternative, yeah, for example, as it's practiced in a grassroots initiative, it's not necessarily the unmaking of capitalism as a whole, as a system, whatever that might mean. It's, you know, the prefiguration or the working around some of those elements of that configuration, some of the economic relations, some of the exchange institutions, and so on. So Gibson-Graham work has been very helpful there. So trying to break down and not think of capitalism as one thing that either you have a total alternative, yeah, complete different system, or it is capitalism, but working through these elements that configure capitalism, yeah, as a dynamic set of institutions, practices, etc., that are reproduced. And how do you break that reproduction through working on some of those elements? And yeah, anyway, that was my.
Well, I really feel we're fellow travelers. It's very lovely to have had you here, and it's been a real joy listening to your thoughts on it. And I do urge you, if you haven't talked to Åsa and Christina, that there's a chance for you guys to have a little bit of a chat about Unmaking. But I do also want to formally end now, because in whichever time zone you are, we've had an hour together, and I think it's time to move on, isn't it, Christina? So thanks again. Thanks, people, for turning out. Are we able to keep this space open for a little bit longer in case people want to just talk a little bit? I personally, unfortunately, have to go to something, but it's been really great to see a lot of people here.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you both.
Thank you.